What if the world is less solid than it feels? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally less fixed, less settled, less complete, until someone is there to witness it. Every morning, we move through a reality that feels finished. Streets hold their shape. Objects stay where we left them. The past feels locked behind us, the future unopened but waiting. We trust this stability without thinking much about it. It's the quiet agreement that allows daily life to function. But beneath that confidence is a question most of us rarely stop to ask. Does the world exist in the same way when no one is looking? This question isn't new. It has echoed through philosophy for centuries, whispered by thinkers who wondered whether existence requires perception. Yet for most of history, it remained abstract, an idea for late-night conversations or academic debate. Then, science began asking it seriously. In the early 20th century, physicists discovered something unsettling while studying the smallest building blocks of nature. Particles didn't behave like tiny solid objects. They behaved like possibilities, waves of probability. They refused to choose a single state until measured. Observation didn't just reveal what was there, it seemed to decide what would be there. At first, this strangeness was confined to the microscopic realm. Electrons, photons, particles too small to trouble everyday intuition. It was tempting to believe the weirdness stopped there, safely contained at the bottom of reality. But it didn't. Over time, cracks began to appear in the wall, separating the quantum world from our own. Certain experiments suggested that the act of looking, of measuring, of paying attention, played a role far more active than anyone expected. Reality behaved differently when it was watched. And outside the laboratory, stranger stories surfaced, places where events seemed to depend on witnesses, phenomena that appeared more vividly when observed and faded when ignored. Objects that felt unstable, as if they hovered between existing and not existing, waiting for attention to anchor them. These stories were easy to dismiss. Human perception is unreliable. Memory distorts. Coincidences cluster where curiosity looks hardest. Skepticism is necessary, and yet the pattern persisted, again and again. Across cultures, decades, and disciplines, the same uneasy theme emerged. Observation didn't merely record reality, it shaped it. This documentary is not about proving the impossible. It's about standing at the edge of what we know and admitting where certainty begins to fray. It's about moments when the universe behaves less like a finished structure and more like an unfinished sentence, waiting for someone to read it aloud. Each chapter in this journey explores a case where observation seems to matter in unexpected ways. Some are rooted in well-established science. Others live in the gray space between explanation and mystery. None will be offered as final truth. Instead, they will be treated as mirrors. Mirrors reflecting a deeper question about our relationship with the world we inhabit. Are we passive witnesses, moving through a fully formed universe? Or are we participants, quietly involved in bringing reality into focus simply by being aware of it? If observation plays even a small role in shaping what exists, the implications are profound. It suggests that attention is not neutral, that awareness carries weight, that the universe may be less like a stage and more like a conversation, one that responds when spoken to, and it raises a final, unsettling thought. If observation gives form to reality, then what happens to the vast stretches of existence no one is watching? The empty rooms, the unvisited places, the forgotten moments. Do they wait, or do they blur, soften, and dissolve, becoming something only potential, until a conscious presence arrives and asks them to be real. This story begins there, in the space between looking and not looking, in the fragile moment where possibility turns into fact. Because before we can understand what disappears when no one is watching, we first have to ask what it means to see it all. It started with a face that shouldn't have been there. August 1971, a small kitchen in Bélmez de la Moraleda, a quiet town in southern Spain. Maria Gomez's camera was sweeping the floor when she saw it, a human face emerging from the concrete beneath her feet. Not painted, not carved, just appearing. As if the cement had begun to remember a person who was never there. She tried to scrub it away. Then she attacked it with a pickaxe, but the face came back, and then more followed. They weren't illusions. Neighbors saw them. Researchers saw them. Over the years, the floor and walls of that kitchen produced dozens of faces, some serene, others anguished. They faded, returned, shifted expression. The cement seemed alive, responsive, watching. Scientists studied the site. Photographs were taken. Samples were removed for testing. They found no paint, no pigment, no chemical manipulation. Nothing that should have created images in solid concrete. Still, the faces kept coming. But here's where the story turns. The phenomenon wasn't constant. The faces didn't simply exist like murals etched in stone. They changed in rhythm with human presence. When the house was empty, the faces grew faint. When visitors arrived, especially when they came with cameras, the faces deepened, sharpened, multiplied. More watchers meant more faces. Some researchers tried to catch the process on film. Cameras malfunctioned, hidden devices failed, but occasionally, recording succeeded, showing images forming slowly over hours. The concrete itself rearranged, molecular structure shifting, lines emerging where there had been none, only when someone was there to see it. Skeptics called it a hoax. They suggested the family had planted the images to attract fame, attention, profit. And yet, the faces didn't follow profit's logic. They appeared long after the cameras left. They continued long after the media forgot. Maria never became rich. She never stopped being frightened. In 2004, an archaeological excavation revealed what lay beneath the kitchen. Human remains, bones, artifacts. The house had been built over an ancient burial ground. That discovery explained the location, but not the behavior. Why did the faces only form in the presence of people? Why did they respond to gaze? This is not a ghost story. It's a story about interaction between presence and phenomenon, between observer and event. The Bélmez Faces don't suggest spirits as much as they suggest a deeper, more disquieting truth, that some things only exist when seen. The faces weren't carved. They weren't left behind. They were created in real time by the act of looking, or perhaps more accurately, co-created, as if the concrete and the witness were collaborating in bringing something into reality. When fragments of the floor were removed and taken to labs, the faces on those sections faded and never returned. The phenomenon refused to survive outside its original context. It was site-specific, observer-specific, a performance meant for presence. And when no one was there to look, the stage went dark. So what were the Bélmez Faces? Artifacts of collective memory? Quantum anomalies? Expressions of an old world pressing through the surface of a new one? Or were they something even stranger? A reminder that looking is not passive, that attention carries intention, that observation might be the final ingredient required to make something real. And if that's true, if human presence can draw faces from stone, what else might we be conjuring every time we open our eyes? And what fades the moment we turn away? A valley in Norway lights up only when someone is watching. The Hessdalen Valley, remote and quiet, tucked between forested hills in central Norway, has long been home to a peculiar phenomenon. Lights. Floating, dancing, glowing lights. They've been seen by farmers, school teachers, scientists. Orbs of white, yellow, blue, sometimes hovering, sometimes zipping silently across the sky, then vanishing. Not aircraft, not stars, not the aurora borealis. Something else. The sightings peaked in the 1980s. So frequently did they appear that locals began keeping logs. Tourists arrived with binoculars and tripods. Scientists set up camp. That's when something odd happened. The more they watched, the more the lights appeared. A team of Norwegian and Italian researchers established the Hessdalen Automatic Measurement Station in 1998. It was designed to run continuously, capturing whatever the sky might offer. Cameras, radar, electromagnetic sensors. Everything operated without human presence. But the results didn't line up. When researchers were physically present, watching, waiting, the lights appeared more often, more brightly, more dramatically. When the equipment ran alone, the sky was often still. It wasn't a matter of detection failure. The gear worked, but the lights showed up less when no one was watching. Even stranger, the lights sometimes reacted to being observed. When cameras panned toward them, they shifted behavior, changing direction, pulsing, moving closer. Witnesses described the unnerving sensation that the lights were aware of being seen, not just responsive, attentive. What were they? One theory suggested the lights were plasma formations created by the valley's unique geological and magnetic features. That might explain their presence, but not their behavior. Plasma doesn't respond to gaze. Plasma doesn't wait until someone is there to perform. Other theories went further. Maybe these were manifestations of collective consciousness, thought forms, embodied attention, phenomena pulled from the edge of physics by the presence of mind. And maybe not. Maybe they were simply what they appeared to be. Lights that exist more vividly when watched. The Hessdalen researchers were careful. They recorded everything. The lights were not hallucinations. They registered on radar, were caught on film from multiple angles, showed measurable properties, but those properties changed under observation. More observers, more lights, fewer observers, less. An inverse law of presence. This pattern has no place in classical physics. In that world, observation is passive. It doesn't alter the equation. The light in the sky should do what it does, regardless of who's watching. But quantum mechanics tells another story. At the smallest scales, observation and outcome are entangled. A particle behaves differently when measured. Attention becomes a variable. Could that principle stretch further than we thought? Could entire events, entire phenomena, be tethered to human presence? Hessdalen offers no answers. The lights are still there, sporadic but persistent. The research station still waits with its silent instruments, and the valley still whispers the same unsettling truth. The lights arrive when we do, disappear when we don't, as if they exist only to be seen, or more precisely, as if they exist only when they are seen. And if that's the case, then what else, beyond Hessdalen, waits in stillness for the gaze that will bring it into being? Not because it needs to be watched, but because watching is what makes it real. A wave becomes a particle the moment you look at it. In 1801, physicist Thomas Young performed a simple experiment. He shined light through two narrow slits and watched the resulting pattern on a screen behind them. What he saw was interference, ripples of brightness and darkness, proof that light behaved like a wave, spreading and overlapping. 2 centuries later, the experiment was repeated with more precision. Scientists fired individual particles, electrons, photons, through the same setup, one at a time, and the results became impossible. When no one observed which slit the particle went through, it behaved like a wave. It passed through both slits simultaneously. It interfered with itself. It created the same rippled pattern Young had seen. But when scientists placed a detector to observe the path, when they tried to see which slit the particle chose, the behavior changed instantly, drastically. The interference disappeared. The particle chose one slit or the other, never both. The pattern became that of a particle, not a wave. Nothing else changed. The only difference was the act of observation. Looking changed the outcome. The quantum world, it seemed, didn't make up its mind until someone was watching. At first, this was dismissed as a quirk of scale, quantum strangeness, far removed from our daily lives. But it didn't stay confined. Further experiments, more refined, more audacious, pushed the boundaries. In one version, known as the delayed choice experiment, scientists delayed the decision to observe until after the particle had already passed through the slits, and still the result changed, as if reality reached backward in time to adjust itself to the presence or absence of observation. Cause followed effect. Measurement reshaped history. This is not theory. It has been replicated, peer-reviewed, accepted. It is one of the most solid, unsettling truths in physics. At the smallest level, reality does not exist in a definite form until it is observed. Until that moment, it is a cloud of possibilities. Positions, paths, outcomes, all equally real, none fully chosen. This challenges everything we assume about the world. We think of objects as existing independently. A chair is a chair, whether or not anyone sits in it. A planet orbits, whether or not we point a telescope at it. But if particles, the building blocks of everything, don't take on definite properties until they are measured, what does that mean for the things made from them? At what point does reality stop waiting to be seen? Physicists disagree. Some argue that observation requires only interaction with the environment, no consciousness needed. Others suggest the mind plays a role, that awareness is the key. No one knows where the boundary lies. But the implications linger. If the universe is made of things that don't exist until they are observed, then we are part of the machinery that makes reality real, not as creators in a mystical sense, but as participants in a process more delicate than we imagined. We don't just live in the world, we help bring it into focus, not with our hands, but with our eyes. And when we turn away, when no one is measuring, watching, noticing, what happens then? Does the wave remain uncollapsed? Does the particle go unwitnessed, undefined, unreal? Quantum physics doesn't answer that. It only asks us to reconsider the oldest assumption of all, that the world is always there, whether we see it or not. And maybe, just maybe, it isn't. A lighthouse stood silent, but something inside was shifting. December 26th, 1900. A relief ship arrived at the Flannan Isles off the remote coast of Scotland. Its crew expected to find 3 lighthouse keepers waiting. Instead, they found nothing. The lighthouse was still. The fire had gone out. Food was on the table, untouched. Clocks had stopped. Oilskins, heavy gear, needed to face storms, were left neatly inside, and the men were gone. The logs they left behind were even stranger. One described a violent storm on December 12th, but no such weather was recorded that day. Another mentioned equipment damage that on inspection had never occurred. The final entry, dated December 15th, read simply, "God is over all." Then nothing. The official investigation noted other oddities. The west landing was damaged. The east landing was untouched, though both should have been exposed to the same conditions. Ropes were logged as missing, then found exactly where they should have been. Objects were recorded as broken, then later found intact. Reality inside the lighthouse was inconsistent, not just mysterious, but contradictory. And over the years, new keepers who came to man the lighthouse reported more anomalies. Tools misplaced, wet clothes that should be dry, doors found open after being locked, items disappearing and then reappearing exactly where they had been searched for, only after someone went looking again, but only when no one was watching. Turn your back, and the world inside seemed to reshuffle. One keeper in the 1950s tried to fight back against the uncertainty. He catalogued every object meticulously, inventoried, logged, double-checked. But still, objects slipped through. Items would vanish during routine inspections, only to reappear the moment someone intentionally searched for them. It was as if reality waited for attention to decide what existed. In 1971, the lighthouse was automated. No more keepers, no more human presence, and the phenomena ceased, or at least no one was there to see if they continued. The Flannan Isles mystery is often framed as a tale of disappearance, of sailors lost to the sea. But beneath the folklore lies something deeper, a structure that seemed to come undone when left alone. A building where observation wasn't passive, but active, stabilizing, clarifying. When someone was watching, objects stayed where they belonged. When no one watched, they wandered. This echoes the logic of quantum mechanics, writ large, things that exist in superposition until measured. Possibilities collapsing into facts only when someone looks. But this was not a subatomic particle. This was a lighthouse, the most rational of places, the most grounded, built to stand against chaos. And yet, within its walls, reality itself seemed uncertain. Perhaps it was coincidence, a trick of memory, a storm misrecorded, the mind filling gaps. Or perhaps it was something else, a reminder that observation might do more than record the world. It might hold it in place, that without someone to bear witness, even the stones of a lighthouse can begin to shift. And if that's true, if attention is the thread that keeps the fabric from unraveling, then what happens when a place is left unobserved for too long? Does it sleep, or does it blur, flicker, and begin to forget what it was supposed to be? In the quiet of the Flannan Isles, that question lingers, not just about what vanished, but about what was ever truly there to begin with. A garden, a camera, and a pair of girls who believed in fairies. It was 1917, in Cottingley, England. Two cousins, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, borrowed Elsie's father's camera and took photographs that would become world famous. In the images, the girls appeared to be interacting with fairies, small, winged creatures dancing beside a stream. To adult eyes, the fairies looked suspiciously like paper cutouts. And eventually, decades later, Elsie and Frances admitted they had faked 4 of the 5 photos using cardboard and hat pins, but not the 5th. The last photograph, the one they called the real one, was different. Even as old women, Long after the others were exposed, both Elsie and Francis insisted the fifth image showed something genuine, something that couldn't be explained away, and modern analysis would suggest they may have been right. The fifth photo showed Francis surrounded by several faint, luminous figures in mid-flight. Unlike the earlier shots, these didn't have the crisp edges of cutouts. They were blurred, not from motion, but from something else, something stranger. Experts examining the original glass plate noted that the figures seemed to change depending on how they were observed. Under low magnification, they appeared as streaks of motion. Under high magnification, they broke apart into patterns of grain and light distortion. But at a specific middle scale, roughly equivalent to the naked eye, they resolved into clear shapes, fairies, but only when viewed the right way. Francis claimed that the fairies were real, not mythical creatures, but phenomena that only appeared under certain conditions, when the girls were watching with belief, with wonder, with attention unclouded by skepticism. Adults, she said, never saw them. They looked with doubt and found nothing. But when the girls looked, really looked, the fairies came. Modern digital scans of the original plate revealed something else. The figures had motion blur patterns inconsistent with any physical object. It was as if they flickered in and out of the exposure during the fraction of a second the shutter was open, as if they existed only in fragments. Only when the camera and the girls were looking, and then only briefly. The other photographs were hoaxes, imitations, attempts to recreate something the girls had once genuinely seen but couldn't summon again. They tried to fake a miracle that had, for one moment, been real. But what does real mean when something only appears under observation? Fairies are folklore, yes, but this story is about more than fairies. It's about the intersection of attention and manifestation. It's about the possibility that belief, not as dogma, but as focused presence, can bring phenomena into being. That young minds, untethered from adult certainty, might glimpse patterns reality usually keeps hidden. Quantum physicist David Bohm once proposed that consciousness and matter are not separate, but entangled. That the act of attention might help shape what is. If that's true, perhaps the fifth Cottingley photograph wasn't a glimpse into fantasy. Perhaps it was a brief collapse of possibility into form, something that hovered between being and not being until someone looked with enough belief to bring it into the light. And if a child's gaze could summon such a thing for the fraction of a second, what else might flicker into existence the moment we choose to see it, really see it, without doubt? And how many such things have we missed, simply because we never thought to look that way again? A desert breathes with light, but only when it's being watched. Marfa, Texas, a small town on the edge of vast silence. Out in the desert, near Route 90, strange orbs of light appear in the night. They float, drift, pulse, divide. Sometimes they dance. Sometimes they vanish the moment you try to chase them. They've been seen for over a century by ranchers, travelers, soldiers, skeptics, scientists, glowing spheres that flicker just above the horizon and seem to defy explanation. The Marfa Lights. Thousands have witnessed them. But what truly confounds researchers is not just that they exist, but when. They appear more often when someone is there to see them. The phenomenon is irregular. Some nights, nothing. Others, a full display. But patterns have emerged. When crowds gather at the official viewing area, the lights show up more often. When researchers arrive with cameras and instruments, the activity increases. When the desert is empty, the lights fade. Automated cameras, left running unattended, rarely capture the same displays. Human presence, it seems, changes something. In 2004, a team from the Society for Scientific Exploration installed monitoring stations to run around the clock. The cameras worked. The sensors worked. But during long stretches without visitors, almost nothing happened. Then, when researchers returned to adjust the equipment, when people were present, the lights returned. It wasn't the gear, it was the watches. To test this further, they divided their cameras. Some actively operated by people, others left alone. The manned stations recorded significantly more light events than the unmanned ones. Identical technology, different results, as if the lights were responding not to tools, but to attention. Skeptics point to car headlights, reflected and distorted by temperature gradients in the air, a type of mirage. This might explain some sightings, particularly along the highway, but not all. Not the reports from before cars existed, not the erratic movement, the impossible flight paths, the behavior that defies even mirage physics, and certainly not the difference in activity between human observation and machine-only monitoring. Lights don't become more frequent because someone is watching, unless something else is at play. Perhaps the Marfa Lights are a kind of echo, reality resonating with attention. Perhaps they're a phenomenon that requires witness, like a flame needing air. Or perhaps there's something stranger, a reminder that observation isn't just passive viewing, it's participation. Like other cases, the lights are real. They've been recorded, confirmed, studied, but their presence feels conditional, as though they hover at the edge of existence, waiting for someone to look, to care, to open the door between potential and form. This doesn't mean they're supernatural. It means they're responsive. They are not objects, but relationships between land, air, consciousness, and time. And when we leave, they leave. When we return, they bloom. So what are they? Electromagnetic anomalies? Atmospheric illusions? Or the desert's own way of saying, I'm only here when you are? Whatever the truth, one pattern holds. The Marfa Lights appear not where we live, but where we go to see, as if the act of going, of looking, of wondering, is what calls them forth. And maybe that's the lesson they carry. That reality isn't something we merely inhabit. It's something we awaken, one gaze at a time. A ship vanishes, not from view, but from existence itself. October 1943. The U.S. Navy destroyer escort USS Eldridge was said to disappear from its dock in Philadelphia and reappear moments later in Norfolk, Virginia. A secret experiment gone wrong. Sailors injured, disoriented, some fused into the metal of the ship, others vanished entirely. It's known as the Philadelphia Experiment. Officially, it never happened. The Navy denies everything. No records, no evidence, just rumors, hearsay, and conspiracy. But something deeper may lie beneath the myth. Not a teleportation experiment, not invisibility in the traditional sense, but a disturbing question about observation and what it means to be real. Declassified research from the same era reveals something peculiar. Physicists working on quantum theory, including the brilliant and eccentric John von Neumann, were exploring whether observation itself could be manipulated. Whether you could stop something from being observed, not by hiding it, but by preventing it from collapsing into definite reality. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in a haze of probabilities until measured. Observation forces a choice, a collapse into a specific state. No observation, no decision. Von Neumann theorized, what if you could keep a large object in that undecided state? Suspend it in superposition. A ship, for instance. There and not there. Real and not real. Avoiding collapse. Evading definition. Invisible, not by camouflage, but by being undefined. Witness accounts from the alleged Philadelphia experiment echo this. The ship didn't vanish like a magician's trick. It became fuzzy, flickering, unreachable to the senses. Sailors described the feeling of looking at something that was there, but not quite there, like their minds couldn't grasp it, as if the ship hovered between states of being. That's exactly what quantum superposition describes. And if it happened, if the experiment was real, it failed catastrophically. Because humans were present. Consciousness kept interfering, collapsing the field inconsistently, a push and pull between reality and unreality. The ship may have been caught mid-collapse. People too, those who were fused with the deck, may have experienced superposition in the worst possible way, not metaphorically, but literally, occupying multiple realities at once, unable to resolve into one. Later experiments in quantum optics have shown that photons, particles of light, can be rendered undetectable by interfering with their potential to be observed. They still exist, but nothing can see them. If that's possible at the scale of particles, what about larger things? The Philadelphia story may not be proof of military teleportation. It may be something far stranger, an attempt to deny reality by interrupting the act of being seen. To make something unobservable, and therefore, in a very real sense, non-existent. The implications are enormous. If observation defines existence, then manipulating observation could reshape reality, not by moving objects, but by removing their certainty. A ship that cannot be observed cannot be confirmed. A person who cannot be remembered may as well not exist. And if observation wavers, if attention falters, then even the most solid thing might begin to blur. So perhaps the USS Eldridge didn't vanish. Perhaps it was forgotten momentarily by the universe itself. And perhaps in that forgetting it ceased to be, until something or someone brought it back into focus, not by looking, but by believing that there was something there to be seen. And that may be the most fragile state of all, to exist only because someone insists you do. What if something could exist right in front of you and still be unknowable? In the early 2000s, a fictional concept began to circulate online: the anti-meme. It was born from the collaborative writing project known as the SCP Foundation, a collection of strange, eerie tales written in the style of scientific reports. One entry described an object, SCP-0555, that could not be remembered. People could look at it, even study it, but the moment they turned away, it vanished from memory. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally, cognitively. You couldn't describe it, couldn't recall what it looked like, couldn't even remember that you had seen it until someone reminded you. At first, it was just fiction. But real science was beginning to whisper similar things. Psychologists studying attention and memory uncovered a phenomenon more disturbing than simple forgetfulness. Certain visual objects, particularly those designed to be bland, symmetrical, and unremarkable, seemed to slip past the mind, not because they were unnoticed, but because they actively resisted memory. In controlled experiments, subjects viewed a table of objects. When asked to recall them, most succeeded, but some shapes, the most neutral ones, vanished from recall entirely, not misremembered, erased, as if they had never been seen. The subjects were confused. "I know I looked there," they'd say, "but I can't tell you what was there." And when shown the same object again, their confusion deepened. "I've never seen this before," they'd insist. "I'm sure." But the data said otherwise. These weren't cases of distraction. They were something else. Certain combinations of shape, color, and symmetry appeared to create cognitive blind spots, a kind of perceptual void. Objects that existed fully, measurable, observable, yet could not hold their place in the mind. Researchers called them anti-mimetic, not because they destroyed memory, but because they never allowed it to form. It's the opposite of a meme. Not an idea that spreads, but a presence that refuses to root. A reality that slips away the moment you look elsewhere. If such things exist, and the evidence suggests they do, they offer a new kind of uncertainty. Not just, did I see that? But does it matter if I did, if no part of me can hold on to it? Because, in the practical sense, something you cannot remember might as well not exist. Anti-memes pose a challenge to science itself. How do you study what cannot be retained? How do you catalogue what erases itself from the catalogue? Maybe these objects are rare. Maybe they're everywhere. We wouldn't know. And that's the point. If observation defines reality, then anti-memes dance along the edge of unbeing. They are seen, but not absorbed, measured, but not remembered, present for a moment, then lost in the fog of inattention. They make us ask how much of the world passes through us unnoticed, not because it's invisible, but because our minds are not shaped to hold it. And what if, at the edges of experience, reality is full of things like this? Not hidden, just unheld, waiting to be remembered, not by chance, but by someone who can look without letting go. Someone who refuses to forget, because the moment you do, it's gone again. A cat in a box, both dead and alive. Until you check. In 1935, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger proposed a now famous thought experiment. Place a cat inside a sealed box with a vial of poison triggered by the decay of a single radioactive atom. If the atom decays, the poison is released and the cat dies. If not, the cat lives. But here's the twist. Until someone opens the box to observe what happened, quantum theory says the atom exists in both states simultaneously, decayed and not decayed. And so, the cat is both dead and alive, not metaphorically, not as a philosophical puzzle, but in the pure, cold logic of quantum mechanics. The cat occupies a superposition, a blend of mutually exclusive outcomes, until measurement forces a decision. For decades, this paradox haunted physicists. Was it just a critique of quantum absurdity, or did it hint at something real, that even large, visible objects might exist in limbo until observed? Then came the experiments. In 2010, a team led by Andrew Cleland at UC Santa Barbara built a mechanical object large enough to be seen with the naked eye. They cooled it to its lowest energy state and placed it in superposition. It was vibrating and not vibrating, moving and still, simultaneously, a macroscopic object behaving like a particle, Schrödinger's cat, made real. And that was just the beginning. By 2019, scientists had managed to place entire clusters of atoms, billions at once, into superposition. Microscopic by human standards, but vast by quantum ones. These were not hypothetical states. They were measurable, testable, repeatable. And still, the rule held. Without observation, no definite state. Even these larger objects existed in probability until someone or something measured them. Observation didn't just reveal reality, it generated it. This wasn't just about conscious minds. In physics, observation can be any interaction, any environmental effect that forces a choice. But the principle is universal. Things don't settle into definite states until something causes them to. And here lies the haunting question. Where does that boundary end? If objects as large as visible resonators can exist in superposition, how much larger could it go? A desk? A building? A person? Could you be here and not here until someone saw you? Quantum mechanics doesn't say no. It only says it's hard to isolate something from all observation long enough to find out. The universe is always watching itself. Every particle bouncing off another is a form of measurement. Every photon hitting a surface collapses something. Constant observation keeps the world stable. But if that network of attention were interrupted, if a region of space fell quiet, if something escaped the glare of all interaction, would it dissolve? Would it blur? Would it become like Schrödinger's cat, suspended between states, waiting for an observer to give it form? We may never isolate something large enough, long enough to test it. But the principle remains, chilling in its elegance. Without observation, there is no definite reality. And the deeper you go, the more you find that reality is less like a solid floor and more like a mist that condenses into clarity only when someone reaches out. To see, to measure, to ask, what is here? And in that asking, it becomes, what if the past isn't behind us, but waiting to be chosen? In the 1960s, an Italian priest and physicist named Father Pellegrino Erinetti claimed to have built a machine called the chronovisor. It didn't transport you through time. It let you see the past. According to Erinetti, the chronovisor could reconstruct events that had already happened by detecting residual electromagnetic signals, faint echoes of moments still vibrating through space. He said he had seen ancient Rome, the crucifixion of Christ, lost speeches and forgotten lives. The Vatican denied it. Scientists dismissed it. And eventually, Erinetti retracted parts of his claim. But the idea lingered, not because of the spectacle, but because of what it implied. If a machine could truly see the past, not just infer it from records, but observe it, what does that say about the nature of time? And more importantly, what does it say about observation? The core of the chronovisor theory wasn't about video signals. It was about quantum fields. Ernetti's notes, later examined by physicists, suggested that the device didn't view a fixed past, but reconstructed probable versions of events from surviving traces. It didn't just replay history, it collapsed it. Just like the Double-Slit Experiment, but flipped in time. In quantum mechanics, the present state of a particle can be affected by whether it's observed, even retroactively. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment showed that measurement in the present could change the behavior of a particle in the past. It's not that the past changes, it's that it was never fixed to begin with. It waited until someone looked. Ernetti's chronovisor may have been fiction, but the idea it touched on is very real. Quantum theory allows for histories that exist in superposition, many possible pasts coexisting until observation chooses one. In other words, the past, like the present, may only become definite when it is watched. Several scientists who allegedly viewed the chronovisor described its images as unstable, flickering, shifting, subtly different depending on who was watching. When multiple observers compared notes, their memories converged, almost as if consensus observation shaped the version that became real. That detail aligns eerily with what we know of quantum decoherence. When many systems interact with a quantum object, they force it into a consistent state. Observation, multiplied, creates shared reality. So perhaps the chronovisor didn't violate time. Perhaps it simply revealed what time truly is. Not a line, a cloud, one that collapses into a story, into history, only when we ask what happened. This reframes everything we think we know. If the past is defined through present observation, then the past isn't behind us. It's beside us, latent, waiting, full of possibilities we'll never see unless we look. And if that's true, then every artifact, every record, every memory is not just a window into history, but a means of selecting it. A photograph from 1890 doesn't just show us a moment. It helps create which 1890 we remember. And every time we reach into the past, we're not retrieving facts. We're building a version of events that solidifies with our attention. So if observation shapes even time itself, then what really happened depends on who's watching and when. 10 stories, 10 impossibilities, all with the same center of gravity. They range from kitchen floors to lighthouses, from quantum particles to desert skies, faces that form only when seen, lights that refuse to appear for machines, objects that resist memory, ships that flicker between states of being, a child's photograph that caught something no adult could find again. They are diverse in scale, setting, and style. Some are grounded in rigorous science. Others drift toward folklore, anomaly, legend. But despite their differences, each points to a single, haunting possibility: that nothing exists in a definite form until someone is there to witness it. This idea is not metaphor, it's not spiritual allegory. At the smallest scale, it is physics. Observation collapses quantum superpositions into definite outcomes. A particle is a wave of possibilities until it is measured. Then it chooses. But that strange law of the subatomic keeps reaching upward, to photons made unseeable through intentional manipulation, to mechanical objects large enough to see, held in multiple states, to behaviors in the sky, on the ground, in places where our presence seems to summon what wasn't there a moment before. Perhaps they are edge cases, or perhaps they are the edges of the rule itself. Maybe most of reality stays stable because it is constantly observed by us, by cameras, by other particles bouncing and interacting, measuring and defining, a web of mutual awareness that keeps the world coherent. But remove enough of that awareness, leave a space, unwatched, unmeasured, unfelt, and the certainty begins to blur. Maybe that's what happens in a kitchen in Spain, or in the fog of the Flannan Isles, or on the nights when the Marfa Lights don't show up for anyone because no one is watching. And maybe that's what these stories are: flares of instability in a world held together by observation. They make us question what we think of as real. Because if something changes based on whether or not it's being observed, then it was never objective in the first place. It was relational. It existed between you and it, not in you, not in it, but in the act of seeing. This doesn't mean everything is imagined, or that reality is fake. It means reality is participatory. And in a participatory universe, nothing is just there. It's there for someone. And if no one is looking, that's when the question begins. Not is it still there, but what is it when unobserved? A room when the last person leaves. A forest with no listeners. A thought, forgotten the moment it forms. Physics doesn't answer these questions definitively, but it tells us this much: what we see is not all that is, and all that is might not stay the same when we turn away. That's not philosophy. That's the architecture of the universe as best we can measure it. And the strange structures we find, faces, lights, fairies, anti-memes, are the places where the scaffolding shows. They don't break the rules, they reveal them. And they ask us, if seeing brings the world into focus, what happens when no one is left to see? A forest, silent, no footsteps, no camera, no witness. A tree falls. Did it make a sound? The question is older than physics, a philosophical riddle meant to prod at the nature of experience. But in the light of everything we've seen, in light of quantum mechanics, cognitive science, and strange observations, it no longer feels rhetorical. It feels urgent, because now we ask it differently. If a tree falls in a forest and no conscious observer is there, does the tree exist in a definite state at all? Or is it suspended, not in sound, but in possibility? We've seen how light chooses a path only when watched, how particles define themselves in the presence of measurement, how lights in the sky and objects on the ground flicker into vividness with our attention and retreat without it. And it forces us to wonder, where does this end? Does a house exist in full detail when no one is inside? Does your bedroom hold its exact form while you're away? We like to believe yes. Of course, the world doesn't hinge on our gaze, but the science isn't so sure. The deeper we peer into matter, the more slippery it becomes. Superposition isn't the exception, it's the default. Observation doesn't disturb reality, it creates it. The line between the observer and the observed gets thinner every year. And then we remember the stories. The ship that became ungraspable when attention failed. The lighthouse where objects came and went depending on who looked. The face in the concrete that refused to exist when no one cared to see it. They are not proofs. They are reflections, windows into the terrifying and beautiful possibility that the universe is unfinished until we interact with it. Maybe that's why some places feel sacred, why ruins seem to come alive under a certain gaze, why an old photograph can resurrect a moment, why the desert opens itself under a full, silent sky when someone is there, quietly watching. Maybe everything we take for granted, every object, every event, every history, leans slightly toward non-existence, waiting, ready to dissolve into a haze of unchosen options. And we, fragile and fleeting, serve as anchors, observers, the ones who choose, not with authority, with presence. Because to see something is not just to notice it, it is to offer it a place in the world, to say, I confirm you, I receive you, I remember you. And perhaps this is why memory matters, because forgetting is another form of unobserving. Let go long enough, and even the real becomes unreal. So we keep watching. The horizon, the sky, the fading footprints, the half-closed door, not to control the world, but to hold it in place, long enough to understand what it is and what we are in relation to it. Not just minds inside a universe, but minds helping to bring the universe into being, one observation at a time. So where does this leave us? At the edge of something vast, fragile, and unfinished. We began with an unsettling idea that some things in this world, perhaps all things, may only exist in definite form when observed. From quantum particles to forgotten lighthouses, from childhood photographs to lights in remote valleys, we've seen the same thread weave through each story. Observation doesn't just uncover reality, it participates in it. This is not a conclusion wrapped in certainty. It's a doorway opened by curiosity. Because while science has shown us that observation affects quantum systems, it has not told us how far that effect reaches. We don't know where superposition ends and solidity begins. We don't know how much of our world waits, undefined, until we arrive. But we do know this: looking matters. Attention matters. Consciousness, however we define it, seems to have gravity, not just metaphorically, but structurally. It bends reality toward form. It asks the possible to become the actual. And the universe, for reasons we don't fully understand, often responds. So what do we do with this? We notice, we remember, we look again, even when it's easier not to. Because in a world where observation gives shape to being, our gaze is not passive. It is sacred. It carries responsibility. To see is to hold something in existence. To forget is to let it slip. And this doesn't just apply to particles, or strange phenomena, or speculative physics. It applies to people, to stories, to entire histories left unobserved for too long. They too begin to fade. So we carry forward with a deeper reverence for the act of witnessing. We light a candle, knowing it burns more brightly when shared. We stand in the silence of a room and understand that even in stillness, our presence shapes the space. We look at the night sky, not just to find stars, but to remind ourselves that seeing is a form of love, a promise, a way of saying, "You are here, I see you, you exist." And if all this is true, if reality does collapse into form where observation touches it, then we are not separate from the world. We are part of the mechanism that makes it real. The next time you close a door behind you, pause. Wonder, what becomes of the room once it's out of sight? The next time you walk past a stranger, ask yourself, who are they when no one is watching? And the next time you sit quietly, watching the wind stir through trees, remember, you are not just in the world. You are helping to hold it in place, not by force, by looking. And when your gaze shifts, when your thoughts drift, when your eyes close, perhaps a part of reality goes soft around the edges, waiting until someone sees it again, and it sharpens back into being.